How could things possibly get any worse for Iran right now, as the U.S. bombards the country with air power, the likes of which it's never seen? The simple answer, yet more air power. Something massive has just entered the Mediterranean as the third U.S. aircraft carrier closes in on Iran. This is a triple threat as the U.S. goes Allen, preparing a massive surprise for the Iranian regime. More carriers, more aircraft. And as you'll discover if you keep watching, the arrival of this third carrier strips away the last piece of leverage Iran has left. First, let's focus on the carrier itself. On March 8th, the Jerusalem Post reported that the U.S. has deployed the USS George H.W. Bush, now en route to the Mediterranean Sea. This carrier will join two others that the U.S. Navy already has operating near Iran, namely the USS Abraham Lincoln and the USS Gerald R. Ford. And like the USS Abraham Lincoln, this latest warship is another of America's Nimitz-class supercarriers. As this is happening, the USS Gerald R. Ford has crossed the Suez Canal and positioned itself in the Red Sea, where it's reportedly lying in wait to deal with any attempts by the Houthis in Yemen to join the war on Iran's side. As for the USS Abraham Lincoln, it continues to send bombers and fighter jets into Iran's airspace, where they are wreaking havoc on ground targets as the U.S. systematically dismantles every ounce of military might Iran thought it possessed. Returning to the USS George H.W. Bush, the carrier has been deployed after completing a rigorous series of pre-deployment exercises that readied it for the tasks ahead. USNI News reported on this training, noting that the carrier and its strike group had concluded composite unit training, an exercise all carrier strike groups must complete before they can be certified for national deployment. In other words, the training is complete and the carrier is ready for action. U.S. fleet forces confirmed this with a statement that will send shivers through what's left of the spine of Iran's ruling regime. The GHW BCSG, they stated, repeatedly demonstrated the accurate and rapid launch and recovery of its air assets. This training was intense. The same statement revealed that during a 28-day exercise, aircraft from the George H.W. Bush flew an astonishing 1586 sorties, making 693 arrested landings in daylight and another 682 under the cover of night. The carrier group's commanding officer, Captain Robert Biba, has affirmed that his team is now ready for whatever lies ahead, stating, "Our job is to ensure that when they need us, whether for air superiority, strike, electronic warfare, or presence, we are ready to deliver immediately and without hesitation." The U.S. has some very specific roles in mind for the USS George H.W. Bush. Stay with us and we'll dig into exactly what this carrier will be doing as it moves through the Mediterranean. But before that, let's consider the immense firepower this supercarrier brings to a war that has been tilting decisively in the U.S.'s favor from the moment strikes against Iran began. Naval technology provides some of the basics, noting that the carrier has a crew of 3,250, which includes 160 officers. It's been operating as part of the U.S. Navy since May 2009, and it packs formidable firepower even before we get to the ship's contingent of aircraft. The carrier is equipped with a Lockheed Martin naval electronics and surveillance system, which covers the sensors, communication systems, weapons, and other electronic systems built into the ship. Speaking of weapons, the USS George H.W. Bush comes armed with Raytheon GMLS Mark 29 missile launchers, which fire NATO Sea Sparrow or evolved Sea Sparrow missiles at a pair of Mark 49G guided missile launch systems, and 420mm Phalanx close-in weapon systems, which can fire in 20-second bursts at an astonishing rate of 4,500 rounds per minute, and you have a heavy-hitting ship. But it's not the carrier itself that Iran has to worry about. It's the aircraft the carrier hosts. According to naval technology, the USS George H.W. Bush typically carries up to 56 aircraft, along with up to 15 helicopters. Unlike the USS Abraham Lincoln, this ship isn't home to F-35s, whose stealth capabilities are still needed by the U.S. and Iran to neutralize isolated pockets of air defenses. But what the USS George H.W. Bush does bring to the fray are several fourth-generation F-18s, along with Grumman EA-6B Prowers and Grumman E-2C Hawkeyes. Crucially, aircraft can be launched at a blistering rate of 1 every 20 seconds, so it would take the U.S. no more than a handful of minutes to get the warship's full complement of aircraft into the skies when needed. So we have another American powerhouse moving in on Iran. But why? We can tell you what the latest supercarrier isn't going to be doing: destroying Iran's warships. Frankly, it doesn't need to, as every major ship Iran had has already been sunk. According to U.S. President Donald Trump, the U.S. took out 42 of Iran's ships in just 3 days of strikes during Operation Epic Fury, and it has ruined most of Iran's air force and much of its network of command and control centers. This doesn't necessarily mean that the USS George H.W. Bush won't be piling on the pain inside Iran itself, as you'll find out in a minute. But this carrier isn't arriving to do a job that the two other carriers surrounding Iran haven't been able to do already. So what is the supercarrier doing in the Mediterranean as it moves closer to Iran? There are a few potential answers to that question, and they start with one crucial piece of leverage Iran still has in its fight with the U.S., the Strait of Hormuz. Even as it's been bombed into oblivion, Iran has still been able to deploy small, fast boats into the Strait of Hormuz to cause major problems for global shipping. For a little context, this particular strait is one of the world's key oil corridors. According to the BBC, Iran has already said it will set fire to any ships that attempt to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, while its war with the U.S. and Israel is ongoing. This is a significant problem because about 20% of the world's seaborne gas and oil pass through this strait. And even though its navy has been nearly destroyed, Iran still has the ability to cause problems in this narrow waterway with its drones and fast boats. At only 50 kilometers or 31 millimeters wide at both its entrance and exit, the Strait of Hormuz provides a natural choke point that Iran can leverage to carry out its threats. What this means is that the 3,000 ships that typically pass through the strait every month have mostly come to a standstill. This amounts to billions of dollars of stalled shipping. Annually, about 20 million barrels pass through this one waterway, the BBC says, which adds up to almost $600 billion of energy trade. Iran knows that it can't directly hurt the U.S. military, but it can strike at the pocketbooks of dozens of nations with this one remaining piece of leverage. Enter the USS George H.W. Bush. As Max Afterburner points out in his analysis of the Bush's journey, it seems very likely that the supercarrier is going to be something of an escort ship for commercial vessels attempting to pass through the strait. Iran's main go in naval force is now these fast attack boats. And those boats with their drones turn into an exploding cantaloupe as soon as they get within range of a carrier. Afterburner explains, having that third carrier strike group there will allow you to escort commercial shipping, protect commercial shipping from drones that can launch from these different naval assets. What this means is that the U.S. can now have two of its carriers pressing Iran, which translates into bombarding Iran itself with yet more firepower, while one focuses on keeping the Strait of Hormuz clear so that shipping through the waterway can restart. This is a clever move by the U.S. It's a way for the country to offset criticism about the major oil price surge, which has resulted in a stock market slump caused by the disruption Iran has caused by exercising its last piece of leverage. If the Strait of Hormuz is reopened, then oil will hopefully drop back to below the $100 to $120 per barrel reported by the BBC on March 9th. It's a little firepower-based diplomacy, if you will, that will allow the U.S. to continue its campaign in Iran without pressure being levied on the oil front. However, the USS George H.W. Bush can do a lot more than protect the Strait of Hormuz. But before we dive deeper into that, remember, this is the military show, and we bring you the full picture, not just the headlines. Hit subscribe if you haven't already to ensure that you're always ahead of the curve. Now, one of the other things that this new supercarrier brings to the war in Iran is the transformation of what was already the largest deployment of U.S. air power to the Middle East since the 2003 Iraq War into an overwhelmingly dominant force against which Iran has no chance of fighting. Afterburner says as much in his analysis, stating, "This triple carrier punch, one of the biggest concentrations of American naval air power in modern times, combined with the massive amount, hundreds of Air Force fighter jets and bombers in the region, means overwhelming strike capacity raining down on Iran's missile sites, command bunkers, and what's left of their navy at this point. This spells disaster for Iran. What the arrival of the USS George H.W. Bush in the Mediterranean signifies is that the U.S. effectively creates new mobile military bases where fixed bases aren't already present for the country. Part of Iran's desperate strategy has been to strike U.S. bases throughout the Gulf region. As we'll explain later, but with aircraft carriers, the U.S. has essentially mobile bases loaded with defenses that Iran finds much more difficult to hit. A third American carrier arriving in Iran's proximity adds up to yet another moving target that can also launch enormous amounts of air power at a country that has already seen its war-fighting capacity diminished to near non-existence. Let's revisit Afterburner's comments about overwhelming strike capacity. Iran will feel like it's dealing with that already. On March 6th, the Times of Israel reported on comments made by the IDF's Chief of Staff, Lieutenant General Amir, who said that the waves of strikes already unleashed against Iran had taken out 80% of the nation's air defenses and about 60% of its missile launchers, though the threat hadn't yet been completely removed. Samir cautioned, Iran has been severely weakened. We see that in the decline in Iran's offensive output since the first day of the war. What started as an attempt to project power through drone and missile launches has fallen off drastically. According to Admiral Brad Cooper, who leads U.S. forces in the Middle East, Iran's drone launches had fallen by 83% by March 5th compared to the first day of the war. Ballistic missile launches had declined even further, dropping by 90%, which aligns with Zamir's claims that the U.S. and Israel have been systematically destroying Iran's ability to fight back at the loss of untold numbers of command and control centers, which only makes it harder for Iran to fight back due to a lack of logistical support and instructions being passed down the line. And you get a force that barely justifies the use of the word. Iran will be wondering how it could possibly get any worse than it already is. The USS George H.W. Bush provides the answer. Beyond snatching away Iran's leverage in the Strait of Hormuz, the arrival of this carrier in the Mediterranean signals the U.S. is truly taking the gloves off afterburner claims. He adds that we're now moving into phase 2 of the U.S. plan for Iran after a devastating first week that has already crippled the country. With a third carrier in play, the U.S. is setting up for the long game as it's now given itself the ability to rotate and rest. This setup boosts the U.S.'s ability to rotate assets and keep fighter jet waves fresh, especially after over 3,000 targets have been hit in the war so far. Afterburner declares, keep that number in mind. We'll be coming back to it soon. But what Afterburner is saying here is that the USS George H.W. Bush is a signal to Iran that there will be no respite. The U.S. is accounting for pilot burnout and fighter jet maintenance requirements by bringing a third carrier into play. At least 2 carriers can now focus on hitting Iran or securing the Strait of Hormuz, while the carrier that has been rotated out handles repairs and other issues. As soon as the rotated carrier is ready, it's back in the game, either adding to the firepower of the 2 carriers already in play or providing an opportunity for another carrier to switch out. Trump has already said that he anticipates the war in Iran to last 4 to 5 weeks, and perhaps even longer than that. Bringing another supercarrier and the air power it brings with it into the fight is how the U.S. ensures that it can keep up the same level of pressure it has exerted thus far on Iran, and the U.S. can do just that. We mentioned earlier that the USS George H.W. Bush doesn't carry F-35s. Most of its fighter jets are F-18s, which aren't stealthy. Naturally, sending those types of jets into a country when the U.S. doesn't control the skies would be risky, but there is very little risk left. According to some, the U.S. doesn't just have air superiority in Iran. It has air supremacy, which means that its fighter jets can fly around and bomb whatever they like, almost at will. The only thing the U.S. has to worry about now is small pockets of Iranian air defenses that have likely been cut off from the command and control centers that the U.S. and Israel have spent over a week bombing into oblivion. Former commander of U.S. Central Command, David Petraeus, says as much, telling The Hill, "We're not concerned really at this point in time about the air and ballistic defense of Iran. As long as you stay above heavy machine gun range, that means you can really just pour it on. Air supremacy has been achieved," he says, and that means the arrival of the USS George H.W. Bush makes perfect sense. The U.S. doesn't need any more F-35s than it already has. The jets already deployed can do the stealthy job of taking out what's left of Iran's air defenses. That will leave the latest carrier group that has arrived to hit targets in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz with its 4th-generation fighters. This layered approach of stealth first and sledgehammer later is what has led to the number we asked you to keep in mind earlier. Do you remember it? 3,000-plus strikes carried out by the U.S. so far. And according to Afterburner, the arrival of the USS George H.W. Bush in the Mediterranean could lead to thousands more in the very near future. And likely that number will double or triple here in the next week or so, Afterburner says, adding, "This will keep constant pressure on the regime." That mention of Iran's regime brings us to the final topic we'll cover in this video. What happens next? Right now, Iran is doing whatever it can to worm its way out of the situation it's found itself in, though there are clearly internal fractures at play that are causing its responses to be mismanaged and confusing. On March 8th, Al Jazeera reported that Iran's President Mossad Pezeshkian had offered an apology to the neighboring Gulf states for bombing them in response to Operation Epic Fury. As limp an attempt as this may have been to curry favor with nations that Iran has tried to bully for years, the apology was essentially withdrawn hours later amid Iran attacking targets in Kuwait, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, among others. Right now, Iran appears completely disoriented, and with the appointment of former Supreme Leader Ali Kham's second son, Mojtaba Comune, as the country's new Supreme Leader, it appears that fanatical devotion to the regime is still going to be demanded, though likely not achieved in Iran. Trump has already called that appointment unacceptable, which suggests that the U.S. is going to keep hitting Iran hard. The new common will be on borrowed time, as it's difficult to see how he could achieve anything other than hiding in a bunker after his own country just painted a target on his back. Iran's ruling regime is clearly in shambles right now. As for the U.S., it's just going to keep going. Trump says that he's seeking nothing less than unconditional surrender from Iran's regime, with Bloomberg adding that the U.S. president seems to have lost all interest in offering a nuclear deal as an off-ramp to Iran. The time to make the deal has come and gone, it appears, and it's clear that the U.S. is looking to heavily influence the direction of Iran in the future. After that and the election of a great and acceptable leader, we and many of our wonderful and very brave allies and partners will work tirelessly to bring Iran back from the brink of destruction, making it economically bigger, better, and stronger than ever before, Trump declared in a March 6th Truth Social post covering what he has planned once Iran's regime falls. So, the arrival of the USS George H.W. Bush in the Mediterranean is a signal. Iran still isn't getting it yet. The U.S. will continue the bombing and is building up its force to be even stronger. Right now, it looks like the only way out for Iran's regime is to move out of the way and let the U.S. bring about the change in the country. Until that happens, the fourth-generation fighters on the latest supercarrier that the U.S. has sent Iran's way will hit hard and fast, snatching away everything that Iran thought it could use to get its own way in this war. There is one man who will be watching these events unfold with abject horror: Russian President Vladimir Putin. He has been shaking in his boots ever since the protests that sparked everything we see now in Iran began. And there is a big reason why. You want to find out what that reason is? Then check out our video where we explain it. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure you're subscribed to Brief Updates so you don't miss our reporting on the U.S. and its war with Iran. Thank you for watching.